Well, it seems to be a little bit of a trend where artists that released albums back in 2014 are now releasing it now in 2019. The same went with Flying Colors, and now we're finding it here with IQ. So let's dive into arguably my favorite neo-prog group. Resistance by IQ. So Resistance is, what is it, 5, 10, 12th, their 12th studio release. Wow. These guys got their start in the early 80s, kind of following suit with Marillion, return to form when it comes to progressive rock, really emphasizing the music and emoting while performing. Peter Nichols, being the main frontman, would come out on stage and, face makeup and costumes and doing the whole 9 yards. And overall, these guys have had a very impressive lineup of albums. We find ourselves with Resistance, and these guys have been putting albums out probably once every 4 to 5 years is kind of where they have ended up with. And Resistance is definitely streets ahead of their last album of Road of Bones. I actually do not like Road of Bones all that much, even though a lot of people seem to love it. A lot of people say this is their favorite albums of theirs. It isn't for me. It really isn't for me. So I love the fact that Resistance is a little bit more of what I want when it comes to IQ. There are a few things that have deviated a little bit from what I really, really love about IQ. The thing that I love most about IQ is the interplay between the guitarist of Michael Holmes and the keyboardist. And the keyboardists have changed throughout the years. And actually, we find ourselves with the same keyboardist from Road of Bones of Neil Durant. Durant? I think that's Durant. And I found Neil was a little bit lackluster. And that's one of my main criticisms of this album in particular. It is still a little bit lackluster. He does a great job of laying down a foundation within a track. He does a great job of providing the atmosphere and providing the mood. He does great of creating those soaring soundscapes, either within like a mellotron or an organ sound, or even just creating all these really strange soundscapes that allow the rest of the players to come in and do their own thing. We also actually have the exact same lineup that we had from Road of Bones. We have Tim Esue from bass and the bass pedals. I believe he was the original bass player. Michael Holmes is again back on guitars. He and Peter are probably like the two main staples. And Paul Cook is again taking up the drums. Peter, even though he is still in the game, and for anybody else, their voice would be probably wavering a little bit, but Peter's still able to play really well within his sandbox. He's really able to ground himself where he needs to be. He's not doing a whole lot of big vibrato, gushing out or lamenting into the void. But that was never really his style. He never really had that same kind of flair. It was much more intimate. It was much more one-on-one. Like there would be moments where he would, be that powerhouse that he needs to be, but it was never that big lamenting. Getting into the structure of this album, because that's probably what the main thing that I really enjoy about this album. It is a double discer, and I love how they were able to kind of divide this album. Now, I'm starting to wonder if they should have released this as actually two separate discs, kind of like what Marillion did with Happiness is the Road, or even what Big Big Train did with the English Electric. And I wonder if maybe that would have work to its advantage in this point, because the two albums are a little bit different. The first album is kind of the sequences of movements. The first 4 tracks of A Missile, Rise, Stay Down, and Alampandria. These 4 tracks blend seamlessly into one another, kind of creating this 20-minute suite of music. And that's probably the highlight. Like, these 4 tracks just start off with such a big oomph. There's no big, blow down the doors guitar solos that we had found within IQ. It's just like this almost odyssey of music. And it isn't until we get into some of the longer tracks of this album, especially within the last track of For Another Lifetime, that we actually start to feel it being presented in a positive light. Like a lot of the sounds that we find are in the minor tones. They're a lot more pessimistic in approach. So I like how the first 4 tracks really blend into one another very, very well. And then we come into Shallow Bay, and it's a little bit of that breath of fresh air, a cleansing of the palette before we are ushered into a really powerful song of Shallow Bay. And I really like where Shallow Bay goes, and being kind of the single of the first disc, it carries itself very well. Like, it's definitely not a star performer in that sense, because I feel like a lot of these tracks are kind of on that same kind of level, same kind of baseline, that they never really outshine one another. And that even includes the 7th track, the big track of For Another Lifetime. And even For Another Lifetime is a fantastic little epic. I say little epic, but I mean it's about 15 and a half minutes, and it's typical IQ epics. Within the past, 4 albums, starting from Dark Matter, we've had an epic on every album. Dark Matter being Harvest of Souls, Frequency being More of the Province, and Road of Bones being Without Walls. And so each of these albums had their own epics, and I felt like maybe they would have run out of steel. Like, I was kind of hoping that they would have put this one more in line of, say, The Seventh House, or perhaps even Ever, where there's a few really, really standout tracks, but they're all kind of intermixed between these really, really great standout single-dosed tracks. But we find within For Another Lifetime, it still is able to really blow down the doors. Like, again, I don't really feel as though Michael Holmes really shined as bright as he has on past albums, and that might have been the interplay between him and Neil on the keyboards. I still feel like Martin Oldford, the lead keyboardist that was found in Dark Matter, that's what really elevated the overall album for me. And not to really discredit Neil on his playing style, because he still does a really good job of presenting the music that IQ wants to play, but I feel like Martin really brought that powerhouse that challenged Michael to battle one another when it comes to those keyboard solos, because I didn't really feel any of Neil's keyboard solos to be all that interesting, and that's definitely found within the second disc, which I'll get to in a second. The one track that I haven't mentioned on that first disc, that's If Anything. If Anything is not a good song. It is by far the worst track that IQ has put out in a very, very long time. It's reminding me of, like, Hold On to My Heart from Genesis, that 80s new wave ballad that I just can't get on at all. It is god awful. It's soulless in being... I was flabbergasted when this came on. I'm like, what are these boys doing? Especially with all that powerhouse that came before it within those first 4 tracks, and I was so confused. I was so confused. Now, I do appreciate that the latter part of the song bleeds right into For Another Lifetime, and I wish they stopped, if anything, before that big organ work, and actually had the big organ work go into For Another Lifetime, because where For Another Lifetime opens up with that kind of carnival fun house, I feel like that would have been great as an introduction within that big organ work that If Anything ended off with. But yeah, If Anything just, it took this album status and dropped it just a bit because of that. And, you know, it almost comes to a screeching halt when If Anything comes out, and like it lands completely on its face, and it does not, it's not good. It's not good. And then we come into the second album, and the second album only has 4 tracks, 2 big epics with The Great Spirit Way and Fallout, with 2 smaller tracks of Fire and Security and Perfect Space. These tracks are all right. I do enjoy the bigger epics of The Great Spirit Way and Fallout. I like kind of the ebb and flow. I like how big these songs sound. I like the big playouts that we have. The Great Spirit Way, you know, brought me back to The Last Human Gateway from Subterranea. It brought me back to, say, The Harvest of Souls within Dark Matter. But I also don't really feel like, I don't know, there's a few points where I felt like they were treading water just to kind of elongate the track. It didn't really have that big playout that I was hoping it would. And it's also really strange being a structure on this. Like, I almost feel like the band could have pulled a tangent from Not As Good As the Book by having that second disc just be the 2 bigger tracks. Now, I mean, not to discredit Fire and Security as well as Perfect Space. These 2 tracks are fine. But I also feel like they're kind of doing what some of the tracks from the first disc are doing as well. And I also think that Fallout is a very interesting and strange way to end the album as well, because it doesn't really end on a big playout. It ends with kind of this big note, and yeah, I felt a little disheartened that, you know, for an album that's over 100 minutes long, it would end on just kind of a bah, instead of being like a really, I don't know, fulfilling play out, like a very satisfying play out. And so, yeah, I kind of like the first album a little bit more than the second album, even though the second album has a lot to offer. In fact, I think the music actually on the second album is probably superior to the music that's found on the first album. It's just the way that was presented was a little bit choppy as well. It does have like a little bit more of a through line, like the songs do bleed into one another. But I felt like they really nailed it with that first album, except for If Anything. And the second album was just almost like a bonus disc, almost. But I mean, I'm still glad that they released all the music on it, because it is still a really, really good time. So I mean, overall, lots of music on this album, lots of really, really good times. I never felt bored, even though I was really hoping for some really, really meaty guitar work mixed with that keyboard work. And unfortunately, I just didn't find that on here. I do feel like Michael was a little lackluster on this album in terms of the guitar work, not quite as sophisticated as some of his past work. There weren't any like jump on the couch and air guitar moments that we found on like Ever. I feel like they're leaning more towards an atmospheric framework as opposed to a riffy framework. Anyway, a long-winded way. This one for me is definitely a download. This is one that I would easily download. So yeah, that's about it. That's about it for Resistance from IQ. What did you guys think? Did you love it? Did you hate it? Whatever you thought, let me know of your own comments by commenting down below. Thank you guys so much for watching. As always, you guys are definitely the best. I love IQ, and I love the fact that they're still putting out music, and a lot of music, to be sure. And I'm going to enjoy really listening to this music throughout the rest of the year, because I know I'm going to come back to it. All right, so that's about it. That's enough for me yammering on. So I guess all that's left to say is, until next time, notes out.